Hello. We're back with some more Federalist paper reading. It looks like my connection's holding together this week, maybe. Last week it was kind of stormy outside, so maybe that was why. But just OBS was red, and YouTube was throwing up errors and buffering, so I moved it to this week. And then when I moved it to this week, I forgot to change the time slot, so I had it for 2 o'clock Eastern time, and I was planning to stream at 3 the whole time. So I woke up from my nap at 2:30 and checked YouTube, and it said I was supposed to be live already, but we're here. So last week, we kind of left off in the middle of a topic, which isn't ideal. I didn't realize that we were just leaving it hanging, but not last week. Whenever the last time we read this was. But let's see, we read Federalist paper number 47, which covered like the separation of powers, like the legislative, executive, and judicial, and kind of like checks and balances. Then you went through this really tedious discussion of every, oh look, it says YouTube's buffering again. Great. You went through a very tedious discussion of how the separation of powers was accomplished in each of the 13 colonies. And you went through each colony one by one and talked about how their governments were organized. But here in Federalist number 48, these departments should not be so far separated as to have no constitutional control over each other. This is from the New York Packet, Friday, February 1st, 1788. This one is also by James Madison. So I'm not sure how the connection is, but I'm just going to go for it. And if it's shitting itself, I don't know. During normal gameplay, if there's a segment of buffering, that's usually fine. But for reading, that's not good. But I'm looking at the preview right now. It looks like it's fine. It does say YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming. And OBS is red. So I wonder if I should just try to change servers right now or something. I don't know why it's always this. Why is it always when I try to do my Federalist paper stream? I don't know. They hate America, I guess. Jeez, this is stupid. It was fine until I hit go live, pretty much. Yeah, I mean, it is buffering in the preview now. Yeah, I bet if I just loaded up Cuphead or something, it would start working. I don't know. Last time I tried everything and it still didn't work. I tried changing the server. I tried, restarting OBS. I didn't try Twitch. Angela came in after I had already given up and suggested that. But I don't know. I'll give it a few minutes, see if it comes back. YouTube's or OBS is saying over 50% of my frames are being dropped. That's cool. What a piece of shit, It's looking like it's still red. And it's still buffering on the preview. I'm just looking at this dropped frame counter going up like all right, I'm on the backup server and it looks like that's even worse. Great. Man. That's awesome. All right, how's this? OBS is green. Let me refresh this page. I'm still getting the YouTube is not receiving enough video error. Right now, drop frames is at 0%. And OBS is green. So I guess I'll see if this YouTube error disappears. And maybe we can actually get something done today. That'd be cool. All right, YouTube. What's the problem? The video's primary and backup streams have different frame rates. What does that even mean? Alright, OBS is still green. YouTube is still giving me an error though. 2 errors actually. Oh, it disappeared. Now it says stream is healthy. Alright, it fixed itself. Oh, wait, no, it says no data. But it's green. So, you know, we're just going to go. We're just going to go. And I'll go through one paper. And if it's still fucking up, then we'll just cut it early, I guess. Where did this even go? Here it is. And I'll refresh this. Try to get the preview back up. Okay. All right. So this is number 48, as I was saying earlier. These departments should not be so far separated as to have no constitutional control over each other. And this is James Madison. To the people of the state of New York, it was shown in the last paper that the political what the fuck, dude? I'm already getting into words I don't know how to say. All right.
Apothegm.
All right, there we go. All right, let's start again. It was shown in the last paper that the political apothegm there examined does not require that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments should be wholly unconnected with each other. I shall undertake in the next place to show that unless these departments be so far connected and blended as to give to each a constitutional control over the others, the degree of separation which the maxim requires, as essential to a free government, can never in practice be duly maintained. It is agreed on all sides that the powers properly belonging to one of the departments ought not to be directly and completely administered by either of the other departments. It is equally evident that none of them ought to possess, directly or indirectly, an overruling influence over the others in the administration of their respective powers. It will not be denied that power is of an encroaching nature, and that it ought to be effectually restrained from passing the limits assigned to it. After discriminating, therefore, in theory, the several classes of power, as they may in their nature be legislative, executive, or judiciary, the next and most difficult task is to provide some practical security for each, against the invasion of the others. What this security ought to be is the great problem to be solved. Will it be sufficient to mark with precision the boundaries of these departments and the constitution of the government, and to trust to these parchment barriers against the encroaching spirit of power? This is the security which appears to have been principally tied or relied on by the compilers of most of the American constitutions. But experience assures us that the efficacy of the provision has been greatly overrated, and that some more adequate defense is indispensably necessary for the more feeble against the more powerful members of the government. The legislative department is everywhere extending the sphere of its activity and drawing all power into its impetuous vortex. The founders of our republics have so much merit for the wisdom which they have displayed, that no task can be less pleasing than that of pointing out the errors into which they have fallen. A respect for truth, however, obliges us to remark that they seem never for a moment to have turned their eyes from the danger to liberty from the overgrown and all-grasping prerogative of a hereditary magistrate, supported and fortified by an hereditary branch of the legislative authority. They seem never to have recollected the danger from legislative usurpations, which, by assembling all power in the same hands, must lead to the same tyranny as is threatened by executive usurpations. In a government where numerous and extensive prerogatives are placed in the hands of an hereditary monarch, the executive department is very justly regarded as the source of danger, and watched with all the jealousy which a zeal for liberty ought to inspire. In a democracy where a multitude of people exercise in person the legislative functions and are continually exposed by their incapacity for regular deliberation and concerted measures to the ambitious intrigues of their executive magistrates, tyranny may well be apprehended on some favorable emergency to start up in the same quarter. But in a representative republic where the executive magistracy is carefully limited, both in the extent and the duration of its power, where the legislative power is exercised by an assembly which is inspired by a supposed influence over the people, with an intrepid confidence in its own strength, which is sufficiently numerous to feel all the passions which actuate a multitude, yet not so numerous as to be incapable of pursuing the objects of its passions by means which reason prescribes. It is against the enterprising ambition of this department that the people ought to indulge all their jealousy and exhaust all their precautions. The legislative department derives a superiority in our governments from other circumstances, its constitutional powers being at once more extensive and less susceptible of precise limits. It can, with the greater facility, mask under complicated and indirect measures the encroachments which it makes on the coordinate departments. It is not unfrequently a question of real nicety in legislative bodies whether the operation of a particular measure will or will not extend beyond the legislative sphere. On the other side, the executive power being restrained within a narrower compass and being more simple in its nature, and the judiciary being described by landmarks still less uncertain, projects of usurpation by either of these departments would immediately betray and defeat themselves. Nor is this all, as the legislative department alone has access to the pockets of the people, and has in some constitutions full discretion, and in all a prevailing influence over the pecuniary rewards of those who fill the other departments. A dependence is thus created in the latter, which gives still greater facility to encroachments of the former. I have appealed to our own experience for the truth of what I advance on the subject. Were it necessary to verify this experience by particular proofs, they might be multiplied without end. I might find a witness in every citizen who has shared in or been attentive to the course of public administrations. I might collect vouchers in abundance from the records and archives of every state in the Union. But as a more concise and at the same time equally satisfactory evidence, I will refer to the example of two states attested by two unexceptionable authorities. The first example is that of Virginia, a state which, as we have seen, has expressly declared in its constitution that the three great departments ought not to be intermixed. The authority in support of it is Mr. Jefferson, who, besides his other advantages for remarking the operation of the government, was himself the chief magistrate of it. In order to convey fully the ideas with which his experience has impressed him on this subject, it will be necessary to quote a passage of some length from his very interesting Notes on the State of Virginia, page 195. Quote, "All the powers of government, legislative, executive, and judiciary, result to the legislative body. The concentrating these in the same hands is precisely the definition of despotic government. It will be no alleviation that these powers will be exercised by a plurality of hands, and not by a single one. 173 despots would surely be as oppressive as one. Let those who doubt it turn their eyes on the Republic of Venice. As little will it avail us that they are chosen by ourselves. An elective despotism was not the government we fought for, but one which should not only be founded on free principles, but in which the powers of government should be so divided and balanced among several bodies of magistracy that no one could transcend their legal limits without being effectually checked and restrained by the others. For this reason, that convention which passed the ordinance of government laid its foundation on this basis, that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments should be separate and distinct, but that no person should exercise the powers of more than one of them at the same time, but no barrier was provided between these several powers. The judiciary and the executive members were left dependent on the legislative for their subsistence in office, and some of them for their continuance in it. If, therefore, the legislature assumes executive and judiciary powers, no opposition is likely to be made, nor, if made, can be effectual, because in that case they may put their proceedings into the form of acts of assembly, which will render them obligatory on the other branches. They have accordingly, in many instances, decided rights which should have been left to judiciary controversy, and the direction of the executive during the whole time of their session is becoming habitual and familiar." End quote. The other state which I shall take for an example is Pennsylvania, and the other authority, the Council of Censors, which assembled in the years 1783 and 1784. A part of the duty of this body, as marked out by the Constitution, was to inquire whether the Constitution had been preserved inviolate in every part, and whether the legislative and executive branches of government had performed their duty as guardians of the people, or assumed to themselves or exercised other or greater powers than they are entitled to by the Constitution. In the execution of this trust, the council were necessarily led to a comparison of both the legislative and executive proceedings with the constitutional powers of these departments, and from the facts enumerated, and to the truth of most of which both sides in the council subscribed. It appeared that the Constitution had been flagrantly violated by the legislature in a variety of important instances. A great number of laws have been passed, violating, without any apparent necessity, the rule requiring that all bills of a public nature shall be previously printed for the consideration of the people. Although this is one of the precautions chiefly relied on by the Constitution against improper acts of legislature, the constitutional trial by jury had been violated, and powers assumed which had not been delegated by the Constitution. Executive powers had been usurped. The salaries of the judges, which the Constitution expressly requires to be fixed, had been occasionally varied, and cases belonging to the Judiciary Department frequently drawn within legislative cognizance and determination. Those who wish to see the several particulars falling under each of these heads may consult the journals of the Council, which are in print. Some of them, it will be found, may be imputable to peculiar circumstances connected with the war, but the greater part of them may be considered as the spontaneous shoots of an ill-constituted government. It appears also that the executive department had not been innocent of frequent breaches of the Constitution, that there are 3 observations, however, which ought to be made on this head. First, a great proportion of the instances were either immediately produced by the necessities of the war, or recommended by Congress or the commander-in-chief. Second, in most of the other instances, they conformed either to the declared or the known sentiments of the legislative department. Third, the executive department of Pennsylvania is distinguished from that of the other states by the number of members composing it. In this respect, it has as much affinity to a legislative assembly as to an executive council, and being at once exempt from the restraint of an individual, responsibility for the acts of the body, and deriving confidence from mutual example, joint influence, unauthorized measures would, of course, be more freely hazarded than where the executive department is administered by a single hand or by a few hands. The conclusion which I am warranted in drawing from these observations is that a mere demarcation on parchment of the constitutional limits of the several departments is not a sufficient guard against those encroachments which lead to a tyrannical concentration of all the powers of government in the same hands. Publius. So whenever I read older like political theory, when they talk about democracy or representative governments, and they talk about, where was it? I think it was towards the beginning. Basically how there are many members of the government, and so it's less likely to fall under tyranny or be controlled by an outside influence or something like that. It doesn't really reflect the modern state of things with mass media and lobbyists and politics and those kinds of things, like privately owned mass media, I suppose I would say. Because it's just a different environment, I guess. At least that's how I see it. So it's a lot easier to control public perception nowadays than it was back then. At least that's how it seems. I mean, maybe back then the newspapers were just as easily controlled as the media is now. Who knows, I guess. But from the perspective of how you see things in America today, it definitely seems like we are not set up to the point where you have multiple hundreds of members of government and that's protecting us somehow. It doesn't seem like that's still the case, but it looks like my connection was pretty stable during that, at least according to YouTube. I didn't see the error come up at all, and OBS says I've dropped about 1% of my frames, so I guess we're doing all right. So we'll just continue on. I think I scheduled like 5 today, or maybe 6. So this is number 49. Method of guarding against the encroachments of any one department of government by appealing to the people through a convention. For the Independent Journal, Saturday, February 2nd, 1788. This one's also by James Madison. To the people of the state of New York. The author of the Notes on the State of Virginia, quoted in the last paper, has subjoined to that valuable work the draft of a constitution which had been prepared in order to be laid before a convention, expected to be called in 1783 by the legislature for the establishments of a constitution for that commonwealth. The plan, like everything from the same pen, marks a turn of thinking, original, comprehensive, and accurate, and is the more worthy of attention as it equally displays a fervent attachment to republican government and an enlightened view of the dangerous propensities against which it ought to be guarded. One of the precautions which he proposes, and on which he appears ultimately to rely as a palladium to the weaker departments of power against the invasions of the stronger, is perhaps altogether his own, as it immediately relates to the subject of our present inquiry, ought not to be overlooked. His proposition is, quote, that whatever any two of the three branches of government shall concur in opinion, each by the voices of 2/3 of their whole number, that the convention is necessary for altering the Constitution or correcting breaches of it, a convention shall be called for the purpose. End quote. As the people are the only legitimate fountain of power, and it is from them that the constitutional charter under which the several branches of government hold their power is derived, it seems strictly consonant to the Republican theory to recur to the same original authority, not only whenever it may be necessary to enlarge, diminish, or new model the powers of the government, but also whenever any one of the departments may commit encroachments on the chartered authorities of the others, the several departments being perfectly coordinate by the terms of their common commission. None of them, it is evident, can pretend to an exclusive or superior right of settling the boundaries between their respective powers. And how are the encroachments of the stronger to be prevented, or the wrongs of the weaker to be redressed, without an appeal to the people themselves, who, as the grantors of the commissions, can alone declare its true meaning and enforce its observance? There is certainly great force in this reasoning, and it must be allowed to prove that the constitutional road to the decision of the people ought to be marked out and kept open for certain great and extraordinary occasions. But there appear to be insuperable objections against the proposed recurrence to the people, and a provision in all cases for keeping the several departments of power within their constitutional limits. In the first place, the provision does not reach the case of a combination of two of the departments against the third. If the legislative authority, which possesses so many means of operating on the motives of the other departments, should be able to gain to its interest either of the others, or even 1/3 of its members, the remaining department could derive no advantage from its remediable provision. I do not dwell, however, on this objection, because it may be thought to be rather against the modification of the principle than against the principle itself. In the next place, it may be considered as an objection inherent in the principle that as every appeal to the people would carry an implication of some defect in the government, frequent appeals would, in a great measure, deprive the government of that veneration which time bestows on every thing, and without which perhaps the wisest and freest governments would not possess the requisite stability. If it be true that all governments rest on opinion, it is no less true that the strength of opinion in each individual and its practical influence on his conduct depend much on the number which he supposes to have entertained the same opinion. The reason of man, like man himself, is timid and cautious when left alone, and acquires firmness and confidence in proportion to the number with which it is associated. When the examples which fortify opinion are ancient as well as numerous, they are known to have a double effect. In a nation of philosophers, this consideration ought to be disregarded. A reverence for the laws would be sufficiently inculcated by the voice of an enlightened reason. But a nation of philosophers is as little to be expected as the philosophical race of kings wished for by Plato. And in every other nation, the most rational government will not find it a superfluous advantage to have the prejudices of the community on its side. The danger of disturbing the public tranquility is interesting to the danger of disturbing the public tranquility by interesting too strongly the public passions is a still more serious objection against a frequent reference of constitutional questions to the decision of the whole society. Notwithstanding the success which has attended the revisions of our established forms of government, and which does so much honor to the virtue and intelligence of the people of America, it must be confessed that the experiments are of too ticklish a nature to be unnecessarily multiplied. We are to recollect that all the existing constitutions were formed in the midst of a danger which repressed the passions most unfriendly to order and concord, of an enthusiastic confidence of the people and their patriotic leaders, which stifled the ordinary diversity of opinions on great national questions, of a universal ardor for new and opposite forms, produced by a universal resentment and indignation against the ancient government. And whilst no spirit of party connected with the changes to be made or the abuses to be reformed could mingle its leaven in the operation, the future situations in which we must expect to be usually placed do not present any equivalent security against the danger which is apprehended. But the greatest objection of all is that the decisions which would probably result from such appeals would not answer to the purpose of maintaining the constitutional equilibrium of the government. We have seen that the tendency of republican governments is to an aggrandizement of the legislative at the expense of the other departments. The appeals to the people, therefore, would usually be made by the executive and judiciary departments, but whether made by one side or the other, would each side enjoy equal advantages on the trial? Let us view their different situations. The members of the executive and judiciary departments are few in number and can be personally known to a small part only of the people. The latter, by the mode of their appointment, as well as by the nature and permanency of it, are too far removed from the people to share much in their prepossessions. The former are generally the objects of jealousy, and their administration is always liable to be discolored and rendered unpopular. The members of the legislative department, on the other hand, are numerous. They are distributed and dwell among the people at large. Their connections of blood, of friendship, and of acquaintance embrace a great proportion of the most influential part of society. The nature of their public trust implies a personal influence among the people, and what they are more immediately and confidential in that they are more immediately and confidential guardians of the rights and liberties of the people. With these advantages, it can hardly be supposed that the adverse party would have an equal chance for a favorable issue. But the legislative party would not only be able to plead their cause most successfully with the people, they would probably be constituted themselves the judges. The same influence which had gained them an election into the legislature would gain them a seat in the convention. If this should not be the case with all, it would probably be the case with many, and pretty certainly with those leading characters on whom everything depends in such bodies. The convention, in short, would be composed chiefly of men who had been, who actually were, or who expected to be, members of the department whose conduct was arraigned. They would consequently be parties to the very question to be decided by them. It might, however, sometimes happen that appeals would be made under circumstances less adverse to the executive and judiciary departments. The usurpations of the legislature might be so flagrant and so sudden as to admit of no specious coloring. A strong party among themselves might take side with the other branches. The executive power might be in the hands of a peculiar favorite of the people. In such a posture of things, the public decision might be less swayed by prepossessions in favor of the legislative party. But still, it could never be expected to turn on the true merits of the question. It would inevitably be connected with the spirit of pre-existing parties, or of parties springing out of the question itself. It would be connected with persons of distinguished character and extensive influence in the community. It would be pronounced by the very men who had been agents in or opponents of the measures to which the decision would relate. The passions, therefore, not the reason, of the public would sit in judgment. But it is the reason alone of the public that ought to control and regulate the government. The passions ought to be controlled and regulated by the government. We found in the last paper that the mere declarations in the written Constitution are not sufficient to restrain the several departments within their legal rights. It appears in this that occasional appeals to the people would be neither a proper nor an effectual provision for that purpose. How far the provisions of a different nature contained in the plan above quoted might be adequate, I do not examine. Some of them are unquestionably founded on sound political principles, and all of them are framed with singular ingenuity and precision. Publius. So, I don't think I really have much to say about this one. It's just pretty straightforward. But in a few of these articles we've seen talks about the government's connection to the people by blood, and that goes back to kind of the original founding. If you look up the old naturalization acts, like the Naturalization Act of 1790 or 1795, they definitely had different intentions for the ethnic makeup of the nation than the government now. We'll just say that, I guess. And so we've seen this, talk about connections of blood a few times throughout these papers. This is number 50, Periodical Appeals to the People Considered, from the New York Packet, Tuesday, February 5th, 1788, by James Madison. To the people of the state of New York, it may be contended, perhaps, that instead of occasional appeals to the people, which are liable to the objections urged against them, periodical appeals are the proper and adequate means of preventing and correcting infractions of the Constitution. It will be attended to that the examination of these expedients, I confine myself to their aptitude for enforcing the Constitution, by keeping the several departments of power within their due bounds, without particularly considering them as provisions for altering the Constitution itself. In the first view, appeals to the people at fixed periods appear. What the fuck? In the first view, appeals to the people at fixed periods appear to be nearly as ineligible as appeals on particular occasions as they emerge. If the periods be separated by short intervals, the measures to be reviewed and rectified will have been of recent date, and will be reconnected with all the circumstances which tend to vitiate and pervert the result of occasional revisions. If the periods be distant from each other, the same remark will be applicable to all recent measures, and in proportion as the remoteness of the others may favor a dispassionate review of them, this advantage is inseparable from inconveniences which seem to counterbalance it. In the first place, a distant prospect of public censure would be a very feeble restraint on power from those excesses to which it might be urged by the force of present motives. Is it to be imagined that a legislative assembly consisting of 100 or 200 members eagerly bent on some favorite object and breaking through the restraints of the Constitution in pursuit of it would be arrested in their career by considerations drawn from a censorial revision of their conduct at the future distance of 10, 15, or 20 years? In the next place, the abuses would often have completed their mischievous effects before their remedial provision would be applied. In the last place, where this might not be the case, they would be of long standing, would have taken deep root, and would not easily be extirpated. The scheme of revising the Constitution in order to correct recent breaches of it, as well as for other purposes, has been actually tried in one of the states. One of the objects of the Council of Censors, which met in Pennsylvania in 1783 and 1784, was, as we have seen, to inquire whether the Constitution had been violated, and whether the legislative and executive departments had encroached upon each other. I forgot my quotes. That was a quote. This important and novel experiment in politics merits, in several points of view, the very particular attention. In some of them it may, perhaps, as a single experiment, made under circumstances somewhat peculiar, be thought to be absolutely conclusive, but as applied to the case under consideration, it involves some facts, which I venture to remark as a complete and satisfactory illustration of the reasoning which I have employed. First, it appears from the names of the gentlemen who composed the council that some, at least, of its most active members had also been active and leading characters in the parties which pre-existed in the state. Second, it appears that the same active and leading members of the council had been active and influential members of the legislative and executive branches within the period to be reviewed, and even patrons or opponents of this very measures to be thus brought to the test of the Constitution. Two of the members had been vice presidents of the state, and several other members of the executive council within the 7 preceding years. One of them had been Speaker, and a number of others distinguished members of the Legislative Assembly within the same period. Third, every page of their proceedings witnesses the effect of all these circumstances on the temper of their deliberations. Throughout the continuance of the council, it was split into two fixed and violent parties. The fact is acknowledged and lamented by themselves. Had this not been the case, the face of their proceedings exhibits a proof equally satisfactory. In all questions, however unimportant in themselves, or unconnected with each other, the same names stand invariably contrasted on the opposite columns. Every unbiased observer may infer, without danger of mistake, and at the same time without meaning to reflect on either party, or any individuals of either party, that, unfortunately, passion, not reason, must have presided over their decisions. When men exercise their reason coolly and freely on a variety of distinct questions, they inevitably fall into different opinions on some of them. When they are governed by a common passion, their opinions, if they are so to be called, will be the same. Fourth, it is at least problematical whether the decisions of this body do not, in several instances, misconstrue the limits prescribed for the legislative and executive departments, instead of reducing and limiting them within their constitutional places. Fifth, I have never understood that the decisions of the Council on constitutional questions, whether rightly or erroneously formed, have had any effect in varying the practice founded on legislative constructions. It even appears, if I mistake not, that in one instance the contemporary legislature denied the constructions of the Council and actually prevailed in the contest. This censorial body, therefore, proves at the same time, by its researches, the existence of the disease, and by its example, the inefficacy of the remedy. This conclusion cannot be invalidated by alleging that the state in which the experiment was made was at that crisis, and had been, for a long time before, violently heated and distracted by the rage of party. Is it to be presumed that at any future septennial epoch the same state will be free from parties? Is it to be presumed that any other state at the same or any other given period will be exempt from them? Such an event ought to be neither presumed nor desired, because an extinction of parties necessarily implies either a universal alarm for the public safety or an absolute extinction of liberty. Or the precaution taken of excluding from the assemblies elected by the people to revise the preceding administration of the government all persons who should have been concerned with the government within the given period, the difficulties would not be obviated. The important task would probably devolve on men who, with inferior capacities, would in other respects be little better qualified. Although they might not have been personally concerned in the administration, and therefore not immediately agents in the measures to be examined, they would probably have been involved in the parties connected with these measures and have been elected under their auspices. Publius. So it seems like there's some historical context to this, but it just doesn't seem that relevant to our country today, maybe. I don't know. I just didn't really pick up anything from that. All right, so next we have, that one was pretty short too. So next we have Federalist number 51. The structure of the government must furnish the proper checks and balances between the different departments. For the Independent Journal, Wednesday, February 6, 1788. This one is also by James Madison. To the people of the state of New York. To what expedient then shall we finally resort for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments as laid down in the Constitution? The only answer that can be given is, that as all these exterior provisions are found to be inadequate, the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government, as that its several constituent parts may, by their mutual relations, be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. Without presuming to undertake a full development of this important idea, I will hazard a few general observations which may perhaps place it in a clearer light, and enable us to form a more correct judgment of the principles and structures of the government planned by the Convention. In order to lay a due foundation for that separate and distinct exercise of the different powers of the government, which to a certain extent is admitted on all hands to be essential to the preservation of liberty, it is evident that each department should have a will of its own, and consequently should be so constituted that the members of each should have as little agency as possible in the appointment of the members of the others. Were this principle rigorously adhered to, it would require that all the appointments for the supreme executive, legislative, and judiciary magistracies should be drawn from the same fountain of authority, the people, through channels having no communication whatever with one another. Perhaps such a plan of constructing the several departments would be less difficult in practice than it may in contemplation appear. Some difficulties, however, and some additional expense would attend the execution of it. Some deviations, therefore, from the principle must be admitted. In the constitution of the Judiciary Department in particular, it might be inexpedient to insist rigorously on the principle. First, because peculiar qualifications being essential in the members, the primary consideration ought to be to select that mode of choice which best secures these qualifications. Secondly, because the permanent tenure by which the appointments are held in that department must soon destroy all sense of dependence on the authority conferring them. It is equally evident that the members of each department should be as little dependent as possible on those of the others for the emoluments annexed to their offices, where the executive magistrate or the judges, not independent of the legislature in this particular, their independence and every other would be merely nominal. But the great security against a gradual concentration of the several powers in the same department consists in giving to those who administer each department the necessary constitutional means and personal motives to resist encroachments of the others. The provision for defense must, in this, as in all other cases, be made commensurate to the danger of attack. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is, no doubt, the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. This policy of supplying, by opposite and rival interests, the defect of better motives might be traced through the whole system of human affairs, private as well as public. We see it particularly displayed in all the subordinate distributions of power, where the constant aim is to divide and arrange the several offices in such a manner as that each may be a check on the other, that the private interest of every individual may be a sentinel over the public rights. These inventions of prudence cannot be less requisite in the distribution of the supreme powers of the state, but it is not possible to give each department an equal power of self-defense. In republican government, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. The remedy for this inconveniency is to divide the legislature into different branches, and to render them, by different modes of election and different principles of action, as little connected with each other as the nature of their common functions and their common dependence on the society will admit. It may even be necessary to guard against dangerous encroachments by still further precautions, as the weight of the legislative authority requires that it should be thus divided. The weakness of the executive may require, on the other hand, that it should be fortified. An absolute negative on the legislature appears, at first view, to be the natural defense with which the executive magistrate should be armed. But perhaps it would be neither altogether safe nor alone sufficient. On ordinary occasions it might not be exerted with the requisite firmness, and on extraordinary occasions it might be perfidiously abused. May not this defect of an absolute negative be supplied by some qualified connection between this weaker department and the weaker branch of the stronger department, by which the latter may be led to support the constitutional rights of the former, without being too much detached from the rights of its own department. If the principles on which these observations are founded be just, as I persuade myself they are, and they be applied as a criterion to the several state constitutions and to the federal constitution, it will be found that if the latter does not perfectly correspond with them, the former are infinitely less able to bear such a test. There are, moreover, two considerations particularly applicable to the federal system of America, which place that system in a very interesting point of view. First, in a single republic, all the powers surrendered by the people is submitted to the administration of a single government, and the usurpations are guarded against by a division of the government into distinct and separate departments. In the compound Republic of America, the powers surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. Hence a double security arises to the rights of the people. The different governments will control each other, at the same time that each will be controlled by itself. Second, it is of great importance in a republic not only to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of the society against the injustice of the other part. Different interests necessarily exist in different classes of citizens. If a majority be united by a common interest, the rights of the minority will be insecure. There are but two methods of providing against this evil. The one by creating a will in the community independent of the majority, that is, of the society itself, the other by comprehending the society so many separate descriptions of citizens as will render an unjust combination of a majority of the whole very improbable, if not impracticable. The first method prevails in all governments possessing an hereditary or self-appointed authority. This, at best, is but a precarious security, because a power independent of the society may as well espouse the unjust views of the major as the rightful interests of the minor party. It may possibly be turned against both parties. The second method will be exemplified in the Federal Republic of the United States. Whilst all authority in it will be derived from and dependent on the society itself will be broken into so many parts, interests, classes of citizens, that the rights of individuals or of the minority will be in little danger from interested combinations of the majority. In a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. It consists in the one case in the multiplicity of interests, and in the other in the multiplicity of sects. The degree of security in both cases will depend on the number of interests and sects, and this may be presumed to depend on the extent of country and number of people comprehended under the same government. This view of the subject must particularly recommend a proper federal system to all the sincere and considerate friends of republican government, since it shows that the exact proportion as the territory of the Union may be formed into more circumscribed confederacies or states oppressive combinations of a majority will be facilitated. The best security under the republican forms for the rights of every class of citizens will be diminished, and consequently the stability and independence of some member of the government, the only other security, must be proportionately increased. Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It ever has been and never will be pursued until it be obtained, or until liberty be lost in the pursuit. In a society under the forms of which the stronger faction can readily unite and oppress the weaker, anarchy may as truly be said to reign as in the state of nature, where the weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger, and as, in the latter state, even the stronger individuals are prompted by the uncertainty of their condition to submit to a government which may protect the weak as well as themselves. So, in the former state will the more powerful factions or parties be gradually induced, by a like motive, to wish for a government which will protect all parties, the weaker as well as the more powerful. It can be little doubted that if the state of Rhode Island was separated from the Confederacy and left to itself, the insecurity of rights under the popular form of government within such narrow limits would be displayed by such reiterated oppressions of factious majorities that some power altogether independent of the people would soon be called for by the voice of the very factions whose misrule had proved the necessity of it. In the extended republic of the United States, and among the great variety of interests, parties, and sects which it embraces, a coalition of a majority of the whole society could seldom take place on any other principles than those of justice of the general good, whilst there being thus less danger to a minor from the will of a major party, there must be less pretext also to provide for the security of the former by introducing into the government a will not dependent on the latter, or in other words, a will independent of the society itself. It is no less certain than it is important, notwithstanding the contrary opinions which have been entertained, that the larger the society, provided it lie within a practical sphere, the more duly capable it will be of self-government. And happily for the Republican cause, the practicable sphere may be carried to a very great extent by a judicious modification and mixture of the federal principle. Publius. All right, so I guess here is where he was talking about checks and balances. Earlier I was saying that was in Article 47, but there he was just talking about the separation of powers and not necessarily the checks and balances. Yeah, it's tea time. I'm not used to talking, so my throat always gets sore during these reading streams. I just dropped my notes. I take notes when I read usually, so I haven't been taking notes during this, obviously, because I've been streaming, but I have a bunch of folded up sheets of paper with scribbles all over them that I need to either type up or throw out. But I'm going to look at how many more pages we have. Because these have all been fairly short, but I think the next couple might be a little bit longer. All right, so that one's not too bad. And then yeah, the last one's a little bit longer. But we'll keep going. I'll just drink a little bit more tea, and then we'll continue with number 52 here. All right. Federalist number 52, the House of Representatives, from the New York Packet, Friday, February 8th, 1788. This is also by James Madison. Who would have thought? To the people of the state of New York, from the more general inquiries pursued in the last four papers, I pass on to a more particular examination of the several parts of the government. I shall begin with the House of Representatives. The first view to be taken of this part of the government relates to the qualifications of the electors and the elected. Those of the former are to be the same with those of the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. The definition of the right of suffrage is very justly regarded as a fundamental article of republican government. It was incumbent on the convention, therefore, to define and establish this right in the Constitution. To have left it open for the occasional regulation of the Congress would have been improper for the reason just mentioned. To have submitted it to the legislative discretion of the states would have been improper for the same reason, and for the additional reason that it would have rendered too dependent on the state governments that branch of the federal government which ought to be dependent on the people alone. To have reduced the different qualifications in the different states to one uniform rule would probably have been as dissatisfactory to some of the states as it would have been difficult to the convention. The provision made by the convention appears, therefore, to be the best that lay within their option. It must be satisfactory to every state because it is conformable to the standard already established, or which may be established by the state itself. It will be safe to the United States because, being fixed by the state constitutions, it is not alterable by the state governments, and it cannot be feared that the people of the states will alter this part of their constitutions in such a manner as to abridge the rights secured to them by the federal constitution. The qualifications of the elected, being less carefully and properly defined by the state constitutions, and being at the same time more susceptible of uniformity, have been very properly considered and regulated by the convention. A representative of the United States must be of the age of 25 years, must have been 7 years a citizen of the United States, must, at the time of his election, be an inhabitant of the state he is to represent, and, during the time of his service, must be in no office under the United States. Under these reasonable limitations, the door of this part of the federal government is open to merit of every description, whether native or adoptive, whether young or old, and without regard to poverty or wealth, or to any particular profession of religious faith. The term for which the representatives are to be elected falls under a second view which may be taken of this branch. In order to decide on the propriety of this article, two questions must be considered. First, whether biennial elections will, in this case, be safe. Secondly, whether they be necessary or useful. First, as it is essential to liberty that the government in general should have a common interest with the people, so it is particularly essential that the branch of it under consideration should have an immediate dependence on and an intimate sympathy with the people. Frequent elections are unquestionably the only policy by which this dependence and sympathy can be effectually secured. But what particular degree of frequency may be absolutely necessary for the purpose does not appear to be susceptible of any precise calculation, and must depend on a variety of circumstances with which it may be connected. Let us consult experience, the guide that ought always to be followed whenever it can be found. The scheme of representation, as a substitute for a meeting of the citizens in person, being at most but very imperfectly known to ancient polity, it is in more modern times only that we are to expect instructive examples, and even here, in order to avoid a research too vague and diffusive, will be proper to confine ourselves to the few examples which are best known, and which bear the greatest analogy to our particular case. The first to which this character ought to be applied is the House of Commons in Great Britain. The history of this branch of the English Constitution, anterior to the date of the Magna Carta, is too obscure to yield instruction. The very existence of it has been made a question among political antiquaries. The earliest records of subsequent date prove that parliaments were to sit only every year, not that they were to be elected every year. And even these annual sessions were left so much at the discretion of the monarch that, under various pretexts, very long and dangerous intermissions were often contrived by royal ambition. To remedy this grievance, it was provided by a statute in the reign of Charles II that the intermissions should not be protracted beyond a period of 3 years. On the accession of William III, when a revolution took place in the government, the subject was still more seriously resumed, and it was declared to be among the fundamental rights of the people that parliaments ought to be held frequently. By another statute, which passed a few years later in the same reign, the term frequently, which had alluded to the triennial period settled in the time of Charles II, is reduced to a precise meaning, it being expressly enacted that a new parliament shall be called within 3 years after the termination of the former. The last change from 3 to 7 years is well known to have been introduced pretty early in the present century, under an alarm for the Hanoverian succession. From these facts, it appears that the greatest frequency of elections, which has been deemed necessary in that kingdom for binding the representatives to their constituents, does not exceed a triennial return of them. And if we may argue from the degree of liberty retained, even under septennial elections, and all other vicious ingredients in the parliamentary constitution, we cannot allow that a reduction of the period from 7 to 3 years, with the other necessary reforms, would so far extend the influence of the people over their representatives as to satisfy us that biennial elections under the federal system cannot possibly be dangerous to the requisite dependence of the House of Representatives on their constituents. So I'm assuming this is like the revolution of 1688 that he's talking about here. I'm not too familiar with the history other than what Edmund Burke talked about in his reflections on the French Revolution. But I think that's what they're talking. I think that's what he's talking about here. Elections in Ireland, till of late, were regulated entirely by the discretion of the crown, and were seldom repeated, except on the accession of a new prince or some other contingent event. The Parliament, which commenced with George II, the Parliament which commenced with George II was continued throughout his whole reign, a period of about 35 years. The only dependence of the representatives on the people consisted in the right of the latter to supply occasional vacancies by the election of new members, and in the chance of some event which might produce a general new election. The ability also of the Irish Parliament to maintain the rights of their constituents so far as the disposition might exist was extremely shackled by the control of the Crown over the subjects of their deliberation. Of late these shackles, if I mistake not, have been broken, and octennial parliaments have besides been established. What effect may be produced by this partial reform must be left to further experience. The example of Ireland, from this view of it, can throw but little light on the subject. As far as we can draw any conclusion from it, it must be that if the people of that country have been able under all these disadvantages to retain any liberty whatever, the advantage of biennial elections would secure to them every degree of liberty, which might depend on a due connection between their representatives and themselves. Let us bring our inquiries nearer home. The example of these states, when British colonies claims particular attention, at the same time that it is so well known as to require little to be said on it. The principle of representation, in one branch of the legislature at least, was established in all of them, but the periods of election were different. They varied from 1 to 7 years. Have we any reason to infer from the spirit and conduct of the representatives of the people prior to the Revolution that biennial elections would have been dangerous to the public liberties? The spirit which everywhere displayed itself at the commencement of the struggle, and which vanquished the obstacles to independence, is the best of proofs that a sufficient portion of liberty had been everywhere enjoyed to inspire both a sense of its worth and a zeal for its proper enlargement. This remark holds good, as well with regard to the then colonies whose elections were least frequent, as to those whose elections were most frequent. Virginia was the colony which stood first in resisting the parliamentary usurpations of Great Britain. It was the first also in espousing, by public act, the resolution of independence. In Virginia, nevertheless, if I have not been misinformed, elections under the former government were septennial. This particular example is brought into view not as a proof of any particular merit, for the priority of those instances was probably accidental, and still less of any advantage in septennial elections, for when compared with greater frequency, they are inadmissible, but merely as a proof, and I conceive it to be a very substantial proof that the liberties of the people can be in no danger from biennial elections. The conclusion resulting from these examples will be not a little strengthened by recollecting 3 circumstances. The first is that the federal legislature will possess a part only of that supreme legislative authority, which is vested completely in the British Parliament, and which, with a few exceptions, was exercised by the colonial assemblies and the Irish legislature. It is a received and well-founded maxim that where no other circumstances affect the case, the greater the power is, the shorter ought to be its duration. And, conversely, the smaller the power, the more safely may its duration be protracted. In the second place, it has, on another occasion, been shown that the federal legislature will not only be restrained by its dependence on its people, as other legislative bodies are, but that it will be, moreover, watched and controlled by the several collateral legislatures, which other legislative bodies are not. And in the third place, no comparison can be made between the means that will be possessed by the more permanent branches of the federal government for seducing, if they should be disposed to seduce the House of Representatives from their duty to the people, and the means of influence over the popular branch possessed by the other branches of the government above cited. With less power, therefore, to abuse, the federal representatives can be less tempted on one side and will be doubly watched on the other. If only that were true. I need more tea. I should be able to make it through the next article. It is a little bit longer, but it's not super long. I was looking in my physical copy of the book. It's about 5 pages, whereas the one we just read was about 4 pages. So it's nothing crazy. So I don't know where they got these requirements from for being elected to the House of Representatives. I think they're very lenient, too lenient, really, considering the types of people that we elect. I mean, I guess it kind of falls on us as voters as well. But I mean, 25 years, that's very young. Even back then, that was very young. You shouldn't even be talking about politics until you're 30. 7 years a citizen of the United States should be like since birth, I would think. I don't think immigrants should be holding public office. Maybe that makes me prejudiced or whatever, but that just makes sense to me. And this one makes sense. You have to be in the state that you represent. Yep. And having no other office, that also makes sense. I also think like some sort of military service should be required. That's just me, though. So wasn't that what Gibbon said started the decline of Rome? The nobility no longer having to serve in the military? I believe it was. I think that was Gibbon in his history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. I haven't finished it yet, but I got it for Christmas. All right, so this is Federalist number 53, and this is the last one we're going to read today. The same subject continued, so we're continuing on with the House of Representatives. This is for the Independent Journal, Saturday, February 9th, 1788, by James Madison. To the people of the state of New York, I shall here perhaps be reminded of a current observation, quote, that where annual elections end, tyranny begins, end quote. If it be true, it has often been remarked that sayings which become proverbial are generally founded in reason. It is not less true that when once established, they are often applied to cases in which the reason of them does not extend. I need not look for a proof beyond the case before us. What is the reason on which this proverbial observation is founded? No man will subject himself to the ridicule of pretending that any natural connection subsists between the sun or the seasons, in the period within which human virtue can bear the temptations of power. Happily for mankind, liberty is not, in this respect, confined to any single point of time, but lies within extremes, which afford sufficient latitude for all the variations which may be required by the various situations and circumstances of civil society. The election of magistrates might be, if it were found expedient, as in some instances it actually has been, daily, weekly, or monthly, as well as annual, and if circumstances may require a deviation from the rule on one side, why not also on the other side? Turning our attention to the periods established among ourselves for the election of the most numerous branches of the state legislatures, we find them by no means coinciding any more in this instance than in the elections of other civil magistrates. In Connecticut and Rhode Island, the periods are half yearly. In the other states, South Carolina excepted, they are annual. In South Carolina, they are biennial, as is proposed in the federal government. Here is a difference as 4-to-1 between the longest and shortest periods, and yet it would be not easy to show that Connecticut or Rhode Island is better governed or enjoys a greater share of rational liberty than South Carolina, or that either the one or the other of these states is distinguished in these respects, and by these causes from the states whose elections are different from both. In searching for the grounds of this doctrine, I can discover but one, and that is wholly inapplicable to our case. The important distinction, so well understood in America, between a constitution established by the people and unalterable by the government, and a law established by the government and alterable by the government, seems to have been little understood and less observed in any other country. Wherever the supreme power of legislation has resided, has been supposed to reside also a full power to change the form of the government. Even in Great Britain, where the principles of political and civil liberty have been most discussed, and where we hear most of the rights of the Constitution, it is maintained that the authority of the Parliament is transcendent and uncontrollable, as well with regard to the Constitution as the ordinary objects of legislative provision. They have accordingly, in several instances, actually changed, by legislative acts, some of the most fundamental articles of the government. They have in particular, on several occasions, changed the period of election, and on the last occasion, not only introduced septennial in place of triennial elections, but by the same act continued themselves in place 4 years beyond the term for which they were elected by the people. An attention to these dangerous practices has produced a very natural alarm in the votaries of free government, of which frequency of elections is the cornerstone, and has led them to seek for some security to liberty against the danger to which it is exposed, where no constitution, paramount to the government, either existed or could be obtained, no constitutional security, similar to that established in the United States, was to be attempted. Some other security, therefore, was to be sought for, and what better security would the case admit than that of selecting and appealing to some simple and familiar portion of time as a standard for measuring the danger of innovations, for fixing the national sentiment, and for uniting the patriotic exertions. The most simple and familiar portion of time applicable to the subject was that of a year, and hence the doctrine has been inculcated by a laudable zeal to erect some barrier against the gradual innovations of an unlimited government, that the advance toward tyranny was to be calculated by the distance of departure from the fixed point of annual elections. But what necessity can there be of applying this expedient to a government limited, as the federal government will be, by the authority of a paramount constitution? Or who will pretend that the liberties of the people of America will not be more secure under biennial elections, unalterably fixed by such a constitution, than those of any other nation would be, where elections were annual, or even more frequent, but subject to alterations by the ordinary power of the government? The second question stated is, whether biennial elections be necessary or useful. The propriety of answering this question in the affirmative will appear from several very obvious considerations. No man can be a competent legislator who does not add to an upright intention and a sound judgment a certain degree of knowledge of the subjects on which he is to legislate. A part of this knowledge may be acquired by means of information which lie within the compass of men in private as well as public stations. Another part can only be attained, or at least thoroughly attained, by actual experience in the station which requires the use of it. The period of service ought, therefore, in all such cases, to bear some proportion to the extent of practical knowledge requisite to the due performance of the service. The period of legislative service established in most of the states for the more numerous branch is, as we have seen, 1 year. The question then may be put into this simple form. Does the period of 2 years bear no greater proportion to the knowledge requisite for federal legislation than 1 year does to the knowledge requisite for state legislation? The very statement of the question in this form suggests the answer that ought to be given to it. In a single state, the requisite knowledge relates to the existing laws which are uniform throughout the state, and with which all the citizens are more or less conversant, and to the general affairs of the state, which lie within a small compass, are not very diversified, and occupy much of the attention and conversation of every class of people. The great theater of the United States presents a very different scene. The laws are so far from being uniform that they vary in every state, whilst the public affairs of the Union are spread throughout a very extensive region, and are extremely diversified by the local affairs connected with them, and can with difficulty be correctly learnt in any other place than in the central councils, to which a knowledge of them will be brought by the representatives of every part of the empire. Yet some knowledge of the affairs, and even of the laws of all the states, ought to be possessed by the members from each of the states. How can foreign trade be properly regulated by uniform laws without some acquaintance with the commerce, the ports, the usages, and the regulations of the different states? How can the trade between the different states be duly regulated without some knowledge of their relative situations in these and other respects? How can taxes be judiciously imposed and effectually collected if they be not accommodated to the different laws and local circumstances relating to those objects in the different states? How can uniform regulations for the militia be duly provided without a similar knowledge of many internal circumstances by which the states are distinguished from each other? These are the principal objects of federal legislation, and suggest most forcibly the extensive information which the representatives ought to acquire. The other interior objects will require a proportional degree of information with regard to them. It is true that these difficulties will, by degrees, be very much diminished. The most laborious task will be the proper inauguration of the government and the primeval formation of a federal code. Improvements on the first drafts will every year become both easier and fewer. Past transactions of the government will be a ready and accurate source of information to new members. The affairs of the Union will become more and more objects of curiosity and conversation among the citizens at large, and the increased intercourse among those of different states will contribute not a little to diffuse a mutual knowledge of their affairs, as this again will contribute to a general assimilation of their manners and laws. But with all these abatements, the business of federal legislation must continue so far to exceed, both in novelty and difficulty, the legislative business of a single state, as to justify the longer period of service assigned to those who are to transact it. A branch of knowledge which belongs to the acquirements of a federal representative, and which has not been mentioned, is that of foreign affairs. In regulating our own commerce, he sought to be not only acquainted with the treaties between the United States and other nations, but also with the commercial policy and laws of other nations. He ought not to be altogether ignorant of the law of nations, for that, as far as is proper object of municipal legislation, is submitted to the federal government. And although the House of Representatives is not immediately to participate in foreign negotiations and arrangements, yet from the necessary connection between the several branches of public affairs, those particular branches will frequently deserve attention in the ordinary course of legislation, and will sometimes demand particular legislative sanction and cooperation. Some portion of this knowledge may, no doubt, be acquired in a man's closet, but some of it also can only be derived from the public sources of information, and all of it will be acquired to best effect by practical attention to the subject during the period of actual service in the legislature. There are other considerations of less importance, perhaps, but which are not unworthy of notice. The distance which many of the representatives will be obliged to travel, and the arrangements rendered necessary by that circumstance, which be much more serious. Might be much more serious. What the fuck? I'm just going to start the sentence over. At the distance which many of the representatives will be obliged to travel, and the arrangements rendered necessary by that circumstance, might be much more serious objections with fit men to this service, if limited to a single year than if extended to 2 years. No argument can be drawn on the subject from the case of the delegates to the existing Congress. They are elected annually, it is true, but their re-election is considered by the legislative assemblies almost as a matter of course. The election of the representatives by the people would not be governed by the same principle. A few of the members, as happens in all such assemblies, will possess superior talents, will by frequent re-elections become members of long standing, will be thoroughly masters of the public business, and perhaps not unwilling to avail themselves of those advantages. The greater the proportion of new members, and the less the information of the bulk of the members, the more apt will they be to fall into the snares that may be laid for them. This remark is no less applicable to the relation which will subsist between the House of Representatives and the Senate. It is an inconvenience mingled with the advantages of our frequent elections, even in the single states where they are large, and hold but one legislative session in a year, that spurious elections cannot be investigated and annulled in time for the decision to have its due effect. If a return can be obtained, no matter by what unlawful means, the irregular member who takes his seat, of course, is sure of holding it a sufficient time to answer his purposes. Hence, a very pernicious encouragement is given to the use of unlawful means for obtaining irregular returns. Were elections for the federal legislature to be annual, this practice might become a very serious abuse, particularly in the more distant states. Each house is, as it necessarily must be, the judge of the elections, qualifications, and returns of its members, and whatever improvements may be suggested by experience for simplifying and accelerating the process in disputed cases, so great a portion of a year would unavoidably elapse before an illegitimate member could be dispossessed of his seat, that the prospect of such an event would be little check to unfair and illicit means of obtaining a seat. All these considerations taken together warrant us in affirming that biennial elections will be as useful to the affairs of the public as we have seen that they will be safe to the liberty of the people. Publius. I don't know. I've been told that all elections in America are they're bulletproof. You know, they're perfect, they're fair, and this isn't even possible. That's what I've been told. So I don't know what he's talking about. So at my last job, I think I mentioned it before, I used to be in charge of training at the job, and I had to manage people's qualifications and stuff to do certain things. And some of the qualifications would expire every 2 years. So I sent out an email about people's biennial requalifications, and I got several emails back correcting me that biennial is not a word, and I meant biannual. And no, it is a word. Biannual means I think that means twice a year, semi-annual. But biennial means every 2 years. So just a humorous anecdote, I guess, of just people being completely wrong and trying to correct something. I love it when that happens. I actually don't love it. I hate it. But it does happen. There was something else up here that I was going to talk about. It was like about someone who's been in Congress for several cycles. Oh yeah, here. Yeah, masters of the public business. Yeah, I wouldn't call any of our career politicians masters of the public business. I mean, they're masters of something, I guess, but I don't have much respect for those types. But anyway, that's it for today, which we got through 6 papers. I'd say that's pretty good. They were all fairly short, but you know, we're on 54 out of 85, so we're getting there. Let's see, what page are we on? We're on page 266. We start on page 241, so we've read like 25 pages today. That's pretty good. And it's about 432 pages total. So we're over halfway. We have, what's that? What's the math on that? 170 pages left? Easy. We'll be done in no time. About, 7 more streams maybe? I just need to have fewer technical difficulties, and then we can get this done more often. So next week I'll be on vacation, so it's not going to be happening then. But the week after, try to make it happen. So that's it for today. Next week we'll talk about how many representatives each state's going to get, it looks like. And the total number. And then more of the total number. I don't even know what that means. All right, so yeah, we'll be talking more about the House of Representatives, I guess. I was thinking you'd go into the Senate, but maybe that's later. So yeah, thank you for being with me again today. And tomorrow I'll be playing some more Cuphead and maybe finishing. We'll see. Probably not finishing. It's because we got about halfway through last time and the bosses are only going to get harder, so I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, bye.